No sunlight for months, endless freezing nights. What did the Vikings rely on? Besides fire? Would you survive the isolation, tightly packed longhouses, or the relentless cold? Let me show you how they turned the harshest conditions into a way of life. Imagine stepping outside your door, and instead of a brisk winter breeze, you're hit with air so cold it feels like the inside of a freezer, minus the walls to keep you sheltered. Snow crunches, or more often squeaks, underfoot. The sound sharper than you'd expect because the frozen world around you is unnervingly silent. The cold doesn't just sting, it gnaws as if the air has teeth. Now imagine standing there without a modern jacket, insulated boots, or the faint promise of central heating waiting for you back indoors. This was winter for the Vikings, every year. The kind of weather that won't kill you right away, but makes you wonder if you'll last the next hour. The winters in the Viking homelands weren't just an inconvenience, they were brutal. Temperatures frequently dropped well below freezing. Harsh winds blew off the seas without mercy, and for months the sun barely peeked above the horizon, if at all. Days often blurred into a grey twilight haze, while nights stretched endlessly, pitch black and bitterly cold. The Scandinavians had no electricity to light their homes or chase away the gloom, no thermostats to click up a notch when the chill rolled in. Their snow-covered landscapes looked beautiful, sure, but not in the cozy, postcard kind of way. It was an unforgiving kind of beauty, the sort that reminded you daily how easy it would be for nature to win. Even the act of staying warm was a challenge. Fires, essential as they were, could only do so much. They'd offer a bubble of heat, just enough to keep the center of a room livable. But their warmth wasn't portable. The walls of homes might block wind and snow, but they didn't trap heat like modern insulation does. Outside those communal shelters, forget it. No Viking could last long exposed to a blizzard, let alone endure one of their infamous storms, which came out of nowhere and howled across the land with snow so dense you couldn't see your own feet. Yet somehow, amidst all this, they thrived. Not just survived, thrived. That's the part that hooks you, isn't it? How? How does a community, equipped with no modern conveniences, endure and even build a way of life in such harsh conditions? You wouldn't even last 5 minutes waiting for your car to warm up in a Scandinavian winter. But the Vikings not only lasted, they built a culture that still captures the world's imagination today. Their winters weren't battles they fought individually. They were collective efforts, where every aspect of life, every decision they made, bore the mark of their environment. The frozen isolation didn't just shape their survival strategies, it shaped their identity. Picture this. It's mid-December, though midday doesn't look any different than midnight. The sun won't rise in this part of the world for another few weeks, so you wake to nothing but cold, dim light filtering through clouds. A Viking family's day begins slowly, not just out of lethargy, but because moving fast burns unnecessary energy, and they need to save that. The first task, rebuilding their fire, which may have burned low overnight. Without it, the inside of their longhouse becomes an icebox quicker than you'd think. Someone trudges toward the woodpile, their breath misting as they exhale. For a moment, they hesitate. Do they really want to leave the barely warm space near the hearth to venture beyond the door? But there's no choice. Inside the longhouse, the family bundles under woolen blankets, hands wrapped around whatever warmth they can find, likely a crude clay cup filled with something warm. Water, if nothing else. Frost outlines every surface, even indoors. It's hard to tell exactly how cold it is because the only thermometer they have is their fingers, which stiffen and ache if left out too long. Outside, snow piles high, blurring the edges of the landscape into one endless white plain. Wind rattles the wooden beams holding the house together, an unsettling reminder of what waits just beyond their walls. Isolation was another test. Their small wooden homes were scattered across the land, sometimes miles apart from the nearest neighbor. During the summer, travel by longship made social connections easier, but in winter, those same formidable fjords turned into icy barriers, cutting people off from each other. The few who dared to travel overland faced snowdrifts as tall as a grown man, with paths easily swallowed up by storms. You're trapped with those you live with, for better or worse. And in tight quarters, where tensions can run just as high as the need for body heat, resourcefulness isn't just a virtue. It's necessary for survival. The resilience this environment demanded became baked into Viking culture. They didn't have the luxury to complain about the cold or wait for someone else to fix the problem. Instead, they innovated and adapted. Your food needed to last as long as possible, which meant thinking months ahead, from salting and smoking meat in the fall to fermenting fish for sustenance later. Clothing had to be practical first, with fashion a distant second. And housing, well, that had its own challenges, which we'll get into later. It's almost impossible to overstate how closely Viking life revolved around the simple act of not freezing to death. Everything they built or wore, everything they ate, tied back to that one goal. But it wasn't the kind of survival that left them feeling defeated. It shaped them into a people defined by their ability to endure, to laugh in the face of hardship. Even in the dead of winter, they found ways to live. Not just hibernate, hoping for spring to come sooner. Let's go back to that family in the longhouse for a moment. Once the fire is roaring, there's a bit of warmth. It doesn't fill the space though. It mostly hovers around the hearth, leaving the corners of the room as chilly as the outside air. The whole family, parents, children, grandparents, crowds closer to the flames. The air inside grows heavy, filled with the earthy scent of wood smoke, mixed with a faint dampness as frost melts from their clothing. There's no escape from each other's company, no separate rooms to slink off to. Dinner, whenever it comes, will be modest but filling. Maybe a stew of dried lamb, turnips and barley, simmered slow over the fire all day long. At night, there's no flick of a light switch. The fire dims to embers, and the family huddles close together under thick furs. The silence outside is almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of a tree caught in icy wind, or perhaps the distant call of wolves. Sleep comes early, out of necessity as much as exhaustion. They need every ounce of energy for the next day, and the next and the next, until spring finally breaks the cycle. Curious how they managed all this. I'll tell you this much. It wasn't without a bit of craftiness. Their homes, longhouses, weren't just roofs over their heads. They were survival machines, built as much for warmth as they were for keeping out the elements. This became the foundation of their whole winter strategy. Every piece of wood, every tightly packed sod wall, was part of their plan to beat the cold. But we'll get to that soon. For now, just picture it. A society so dependent on their own ingenuity and each other that even the deadliest season of the year couldn't break them. Instead, it made them stronger. Their first line of defense, those communal, fire-filled sanctuaries where survival wasn't just an individual goal, it was a shared experience. So, let's take a closer look inside. Step into a Viking longhouse. And your first thought might not be how impressed you are, but how quickly you need to adjust. It's dark, barely lit by a central fire, smoky to the point of making your eyes sting, and crammed with everyone and everything a family owns. But this simple structure was more than just a home. It was a lifeline. In the unforgiving Scandinavian winters, longhouses weren't a luxury. They were the only thing standing between you and the cold, hard reality of the frozen world outside. These buildings weren't just thrown together. Vikings built them with survival in mind. Picture a long rectangle stretching sometimes up to 30 meters with thick, sloping walls made of whatever materials their environment supplied. Timber was ideal, but if you lived in a part of Scandinavia where trees were scarce, you'd rely on turf and stone, layering these materials to seal out drafts and hold in heat. The walls were designed to be thick, sometimes a meter or more, stuffed with insulating materials like straw, moss, or even animal hair to keep the biting wind from sneaking inside. The roofs followed the same principle, often layered with thatch or sod. If sod sounds strange, think of it like nature's version of heavy-duty insulation. It kept out the snow, held in the heat, and, bonus, even absorbed sound, which was helpful when those brutal winter winds howled for days on end. Now, as efficient as their walls and roofs were, keeping warm wasn't as simple as sitting inside and waiting for the walls to do their magic. Heat was precious, and every aspect of the longhouse was aimed at conserving it. The most crucial part? The fire. Right in the middle of the floor, a long open hearth acted as the home's beating heart. This is where life happened. The family cooked here, lit their space with its flickering glow, and most importantly, kept themselves from freezing. It wasn't just any fire though. Vikings weren't out chopping wood each day to keep a massive blaze going. That would be wasteful. Instead, the hearth burned low and steady, putting out just enough warmth to keep the main room livable. The fire was always smoldering, carefully maintained by someone in the household. Letting it go out would mean hours of shivering while you waited to coax a new flame back to life. But here's where things get uncomfortable. If you're picturing a cozy, roaring fire with clean air and no fuss, imagine again. There were no chimneys in these longhouses. That's right, no convenient pipe drawing the smoke out and away. Instead, the smoke from the hearth rose into the rafters, sometimes escaping through a small hole in the roof, but more often just lingering. The ceilings of these homes were blackened with soot, soaked with years of smoke that never had anywhere to go. Breathing that in day after day couldn't have been pleasant. In fact, it was likely pretty miserable, but it wasn't without purpose. That smoke helped preserve food stored in the rafters, kept pests like insects at bay, and, strangely enough, even helped prevent some of the timber and thatch from rotting too quickly. It was a trade-off, one of many the Vikings made in their constant balancing act between comfort and survival. Inside, the longhouse was organized in a way that made the most of its space. Along the walls, you'd find raised platforms lined with straw, moss, or other materials that offered just enough cushioning to make them suitable beds. These platforms were a small mercy. Being raised even slightly off the packed dirt floor kept their occupants warmer by insulating them from the icy ground. Privacy wasn't a thing though. Entire families, parents, kids, grandparents, all shared the same space, and it didn't stop there. On the coldest nights, you could forget even the illusion of personal space as everyone huddled closer to the fire together. The lighting in the longhouse was another stark reminder of what survival looked like. You wouldn't find big, open spaces filled with natural light. In fact, windows were rare, just small openings, if any, because anything larger would risk letting out precious heat or letting in the punishing cold. So for the most part, the family relied on the fire for everything: warmth, light, and food. Even during the daytime, longhouses stayed dimly lit, and during the endless nights of winter, they really only glowed in patches. Let's step into their shoes, or more accurately, sit by their fire for a moment. Imagine a family gathered around the hearth. It's freezing outside, the kind of cold that creeps through any opening, no matter how well built your walls might be. You can see your own breath, even inside, and the fire is doing its best. But warm isn't the word you'd use to describe the room. People sit close together, wrapped in layers of wool, hands damp and raw from a day of picking through snow and ice to gather wood or water. The straw bedding is pushed up against the walls, but no one dares head toward it now. The fire is the only place worth being. Smoke lingers above your heads, and occasionally somebody coughs because of how thick it's gotten. But no one complains, because this smoky, crowded room is so much better than the alternative. Out there, the cold doesn't just sting you briefly. Out there, it kills. One thing that strikes you as you imagine this scene is just how packed these spaces would have been. It's not just the family, but everything they owned. Their tools, stores of food, even their firewood for the coming days. Winter pushed all of this together into one crowded, often claustrophobic space. But even with all that talk of being packed in like sardines, Vikings still left room for something else. And this is where it gets even more interesting. The animals. Yes, the cows, sheep, and goats that the family relied on for milk, wool, and meat spent their winters indoors too. But we'll get into that weirdly cozy arrangement soon. The Vikings' longhouses were marvels of practical design. Every piece of them was optimized for one goal: survival. They didn't waste resources making anything pretty or more comfortable than absolutely necessary. And yet, when you stand back and look at them, there's a brilliance in that simplicity. The thick walls, insulated roofs, and steady fire worked together to create a space the cold couldn't invade. Sure, the air was smoky, and privacy was non-existent, but the longhouse wasn't meant to be a luxury villa. It was a survival bunker, the place you returned to every night knowing that despite its flaws, it did its job. And those flaws, as you'd expect, were many. Smoke was a constant issue, and though it had some surprising benefits, it made life indoors difficult. Light was scarce, often leaving people to work and gather around in dimness for most of the day. And the heat from the fire, as vital as it was, didn't spread evenly. A longhouse wasn't warm from corner to corner. The heat clung around the hearth and faded quickly the farther you got from it. Sleeping in the far corners of the house, away from the fire, meant piling on every fur and blanket you had to keep the chill at bay. So why not fix it? Why not create bigger windows or invent a chimney? For starters, they simply didn't know any different, and more importantly, the solutions they did have worked well enough. Chimneys may have let the smoke out, but they also would have let heat escape, a sacrifice the Vikings weren't willing to make. Large windows might have let in light, but they also would have let in drafts that could kill a family on the coldest of nights. Their homes weren't comfortable by modern standards, but they were effective. Like so much of Viking life, the longhouse was a matter of clever compromise. Warmth over comfort, survival over luxury, practicality above all else. And speaking of trade-offs, let's not forget about those other guests. When the nights got even colder and resources grew scarcer, these longhouses weren't always just housing people. They doubled as barns for the family's animals: cows, goats, sheep, even chickens. The idea might seem wild today, but to the Vikings, it was another ingenious way to fight the cold. I mean, if a cow produces as much heat as a small campfire, wouldn't you want it sleeping a few steps away from your bed? Don't worry though. We'll explore exactly what sharing a room with your livestock was like in a moment. Imagine this. You're lying in bed trying to fall asleep when a chorus of snuffling, clucking, and the occasional moo surrounds you. No, it's not a dream. It's your reality. Sharing a room with cows, sheep, and chickens wasn't a choice for Vikings. It was a survival strategy. In the dead of a Scandinavian winter, those animals weren't just livestock. They were your central heating system. Here's how it worked. During the warm months, livestock spent their time outdoors, grazing in open pastures or fenced areas. But when the temperatures plunged, leaving them outside wasn't an option. A cow frozen to death in the snow wasn't just a loss of beef. It was the loss of your family's milk supply, your ploughing power for spring fields, and, let's be honest, a solid heat source. So, when winter set in, the animals moved inside. The longhouse turned into a multi-species shelter, and the animals played a surprisingly essential role. Their body heat alone could warm up the home significantly, making a real difference on those nights when temperatures outside dipped far below freezing. Longhouses weren't arranged randomly. They had sections designed specifically for this. Imagine one end of the house acting as the family's living space: the fire, the cooking, the sleeping. Then, a low dividing wall marked off the other end, the byre, as something like a stable. It wasn't luxurious. The floor was dirt, maybe layered with straw, but it was close enough to the family quarters that the animals' heat could radiate through the space. On especially cold nights, families might even move their bedding toward the byre for extra warmth, huddling just a few feet away from their livestock. And before you start romanticizing this arrangement, let's talk about the realities. Yes, animals generate heat. Cows alone produce surprising amounts, like a built-in campfire. But they also come with smells, noises, and, well, waste. The longhouse must have smelled like a mix of wood smoke, damp straw, and whatever the animals contributed on any given day. And those cute pastoral sounds, a goat bleating at sunrise or chickens scuffling in the dirt, might ruin any dreams of a quiet night. Hygiene may not have looked anything close to what we'd expect today, but the Vikings weren't oblivious to the problem. They layered straw in the byre, changing it out as it got filthy, and took advantage of cold weather to freeze waste outside. It wasn't perfect, but warmth now, dignity later, as some might say. For the Vikings, this wasn't about being sentimental with their animals. Livestock represented survival. They weren't pets, they were assets: food, clothing, tools, and in this case, heaters. Letting them wander in a snowstorm was out of the question. Predators like wolves posed a constant threat during the winter, especially when hunger drove them closer to settlements. Indoors, the livestock stayed safe, contributing not only warmth, but also security for their owners. Every living creature inside that longhouse had a purpose. Picture this. It's a bitter winter night, and a child in the family settles in for sleep, their straw bedding pulled as close to the central fire as possible. Beyond that low partition, the cows shift on their feet, loud enough to hear but oddly comforting in a way. The sheep nestle down in a corner, their thick wool trapping the warmth they share. Occasionally, a chicken flutters into the rafters, disturbed by some movement. The child doesn't stir though. To them, these sounds are normal, a kind of familiar lullaby that's been part of their life every winter for as long as they can remember. By morning, the animal's presence will help keep the frost from crawling on their blankets. It's far from ideal, but it's better than freezing. Even housing the animals came with its own clever adjustments. Vikings understood how to make use of the heat their livestock generated, channeling it throughout the longhouse without letting the situation completely overrun their living quarters. The byre wasn't just thrown together. It was built into the longhouse's design. Warm air naturally rose, so some homes were deliberately built with a slight incline, letting the heat from the animal quarters spread toward the family section, while the cold air stayed lower. In a way, it was architecture by survival instinct, simple but effective. And it wasn't just heat. Having livestock nearby was also a practical way of cutting down on time and energy spent trudging outside to care for them. In a winter landscape where paths to the barn might disappear under snowstorms, keeping animals within reach meant less risk and more efficiency. After all, no one wanted to waste precious daylight or energy spending hours just getting the cows fed. Indoors, everything was closer and more manageable. Yet as practical as it all was, there's no pretending this was an easy arrangement. Think about what they sacrificed for that warmth. Privacy, for one. With animals indoors, there wasn't much separation between your family life and the lives of the creatures you were raising. If you thought longhouses already sounded cramped, now there's the added challenge of maneuvering around cows that weren't exactly house-trained. And while their body heat might have helped fight the cold, on certain days or nights, they also made things noisier, smellier, and harder to ignore. The Vikings made it work though, because they didn't look at survival in pieces. Everything was connected. The animals eating grass in the summer became the same animals providing warmth in the winter. The wool shorn from your sheep might have kept you warm through multiple seasons. And if a cow eventually stopped giving milk, maybe its hide ended up in the clothing you wore to weather the next snowstorm. The relationship between Vikings and their livestock wasn't about luxury. It was about mutual usefulness. These animals were as much a part of the household as the people gathered around the fire. They were noisy, smelly, and inconvenient at times, but their presence kept families alive. Of course, the Vikings didn't stop there when it came to making the cold survivable. Their solution wasn't just to rely on animal heat. It was about dressing smart too. You might be warm now, huddling inside the longhouse with the cows, but step outside, and you've got to contend with brutal winds, icy air, and snowdrifts taller than a person. So, what did they wear to protect themselves when even the animals' heat wasn't an option? That brings us to one of the most practical elements of Viking life: their clothing. Wool, fur, and even animal intestines came together to create layers that could outlast the worst the weather had to offer. But those details? We'll get there soon. Can wool, fur, and animal intestines really keep you alive when it's freezing outside? For the Vikings, this wasn't just some hypothetical question. It was reality. Their clothing wasn't about fashion. It was about survival, pure and simple. When you're facing Arctic winds and snowdrifts taller than a person, learning how to dress layers on more significance. Literally. Let's talk about the basics. The Vikings weren't strolling around in breezy linens or flowy cotton. Instead, sheep were at the center of their wardrobe strategy. Wool was the material of choice for everyday wear, and for good reason. It's warm, insulates even when wet, and resists dirt and odors. When the climate serves snow, freezing rain, and wet slush more often than it doesn't. Having clothing that stays functional when damp can be the difference between life and hypothermia. That said, linen, when it was available, worked beautifully as a base layer. It was light, breathable, and wicked away sweat. However, let's be clear, it wasn't your average Vikings go-to. Linen was expensive, tricky to produce, and tore easily. If you had a nice linen underlayer, you either came from a well-off family or, you guessed it, were counting on that layer to last until next winter. The layers didn't stop there. Viking clothing wasn't just about the base. It was about stacking. Men typically wore a long wool tunic over a base layer, which might be linen, if they were lucky, or more wool. On their legs, trousers paired with fitted leg wraps. Think of those as the ancient answer to thermal leggings. They kept your legs warm and snow out of your boots. Women also relied on woolen dresses as a mainstay, layering them with aprons and heavy cloaks for extra warmth. Not exactly a style you'd see on a runway, but it got the job done. Cloaks were the unsung heroes of Viking winter survival gear. Made from thick, tightly woven wool, they weren't just for keeping out the cold. Cloaks were what you wrapped around yourself when the house fire didn't quite reach your corner, what you used to shield your body from stinging winds, and what you pulled over your head when snow turned to sideways sleet. If you had access to fur, you might line your cloak for additional luxury. Well, not luxury so much as survival insurance. But cloaks weren't optional. They were essential. Not owning one. That usually meant you didn't have much else either, and probably wouldn't make it through many winters. Now, keeping your feet warm was a whole other battle. The solution came in the form of hide boots, simple, functional, and built for purpose. They were usually made from animal hides, like cattle leather or sealskin if you lived near the coast. These hides were treated with plenty of fat, making the boots as waterproof as anything could be before Gore-Tex was a thing. The sealing method wasn't glamorous. Boots often looked rough and, well, slimy after a fresh coat of grease, but they served their purpose. Windproof and waterproof. Sure, you weren't turning heads, but you weren't losing toes either. But what happens when waterproof isn't enough? Enter animal intestines. Yes, actual intestines. If that makes you cringe, try imagining what it's like to march through sleet in wool that's slowly absorbing all the moisture it touches. The Vikings weren't ones to waste resources. They discovered that animal intestines, carefully cleaned and processed, made excellent windproof and waterproof layers. These were essentially the first raincoats, though they weren't breathable. So wearing one meant trapping heat and sweat along with the moisture outside. Comfortable, not remotely, but effective. Absolutely. Speaking of uncomfortable, Viking gloves and mittens weren't widely available. Felted wool was an obvious choice when gloves were made, but for those going without, there was no such thing as toughing it out. You stuffed your hands into your cloak and prayed the frost wouldn't travel far enough to turn your fingers blue. Hats and scarves were equally important. Anything that let you lock in heat around the head and neck could mean the difference between staying warm and frosting over like an icicle. Let's ground this in a visual. Imagine a Viking preparing for the day, maybe to cut firewood or catch fish under the ice. First, he pulls on woolen undergarments, rough and scratchy, probably, but warm. Over that, a thick tunic, maybe decorated with some modest embroidery to mark status, but mostly plain because winter doesn't care what you look like. Then come the trousers, fastened by a belt. The belt's not just functional for keeping things in place, it also carries pouches for essentials. A small knife, maybe some flint, or even emergency cheese. Modern cargo pants don't have anything on Viking utility. After the trousers, he wraps his legs tightly with wool strips for warmth, before sealing his feet in grease-covered boots. He chooses a fur-lined cloak, fastening it with a brooch at the shoulder, and tucks his hands in for good measure. By the time he's stepping out the door, he's a walking fortress of wool, leather, and furs. It's heavy, it's restrictive, it's not breathable, but it's all that's standing between him and frostbite. What makes Viking clothing even more fascinating is how much practicality went hand in hand with resourcefulness. Unlike modern thermal layers and synthetic waterproof jackets, their materials couldn't be imported or mass-produced. Everything came from their immediate environment. Wool was spun from the sheep grazing their fields in the summer. Leather and fur were sourced from the same animals they relied on for food. Even intestines, as strange as they sound to us now, were a natural side product of slaughtering an animal. Nothing went to waste, because wasting anything could mean the difference between surviving another winter or not. Even still, clothing wasn't just survival. It whispered something about who you were too. Quality fabrics, like finely worked linen, might mark someone wealthier. If you had brightly dyed wool, reds or yellows, it was a subtle message, saying, "I can afford to show off." Most everyday wool clothing, however, wasn't dyed, sticking instead to the natural browns, greys and creams of the sheep's coat. It wasn't about being plain. It was about using resources wisely and knowing what actually mattered when the snow piled up against your doors. Now, you may be wondering just how Viking winter clothing compares to modern gear. After all, these were thick, heavy materials, not streamlined, lightweight outdoor wear. But what they lacked in sleekness, they made up for with functionality. Wool's unique properties, providing warmth even when damp and resisting odors, are still used in cold weather clothing today. Even the layering concept, where each piece serves a specific purpose, hasn't changed much. The big difference, of course, is that we don't have to skin an animal ourselves to make sure our boots are waterproof. The Vikings, through necessity, designed clothing that adapted perfectly to their world: wet, freezing, and unpredictable. Their gear might not win any fashion awards, but it ensured they could work, hunt, and travel in conditions that would freeze most modern people where they stood. The best part, none of these innovations came from anything other than observation and resourcefulness. They didn't have experts or specialists designing their cold weather strategy, just their own trial, error, and survival instinct. But as practical as Viking clothing was, it wasn't the only tool they used to keep themselves warm. You can wrap yourself in wool and fur, but if your body isn't fueled, that insulation won't count for much. Vikings understood that too. The next line of defense against the cold, the food that fueled their bodies, calories, fats, and hearty meals built to burn slow and steady like a good fire. Because when it's freezing, warmth doesn't just come from what you wear, it starts from within. Forget the idea of trendy diets or ingredient-rich menus. The Viking winter diet wasn't about flavor. It was survival, plain and simple. No one cared whether their meals were exciting. What mattered was staying warm and keeping enough energy to get through long, punishing days in freezing air. Calories weren't an indulgence, they were insulation. Every bite was a step toward enduring the cold. So what exactly did they eat? Let's start with the basics. Meat, fish, dairy, and root vegetables, all calorie-dense and practical. Meat wasn't just a treat, it was a cornerstone. If you had a goat or a cow, odds are you'd rely on it heavily during the winter. the Vikings preserved most of the meat they consumed in preparation for the cold months, usually by salting, smoking, or drying it. These methods weren't elegant, but they worked. Smoking, in particular, allowed cuts of meat to last for weeks or even months. Overhead in a longhouse, the meat hung near the smoky rafters, not just curing in the fumes, but staying out of reach of opportunistic scavengers, both human and animal. And while salted meat could be eaten as is, it was often tossed into a stew, softening it through slow boiling, until it was just edible enough to keep everyone satisfied. Winter wasn't picky about texture. Fish played an equally important role, especially in coastal regions where water didn't freeze solid and fishing through the ice remained possible. Preservation methods like fermenting or drying allowed fish to last longer than its fresh counterpart. You've probably heard of lutefisk, that Nordic culinary oddity, where whitefish is soaked in lye, a dish that could sit comfortably in equal parts survival food and dare. Its pungent smell likely cleared any surviving appetite before eating, but it worked as a food supply. The sheer ingenuity here is impressive. Imagine trying to make your diet stretch with nothing more than some cod, some chemicals, and an endless winter ahead of you. Preserved meat and fish were the staples, but winter life didn't just run on protein. Vikings needed carbohydrates, and they got them wherever they could. Grains like barley and rye made regular appearances at the table, often in the form of dense, dark bread. These weren't fluffy loaves with crusty exteriors. They were heavy, crumbly, and occasionally extended with ingredients like seeds, or even tree bark. That's not a metaphor. Tree bark was actually ground into the flour to stretch supplies when grain ran low. Porridge, too, was a staple. Barley or oats, water, maybe a splash of milk if it was available. And there, one more belly filled. There was nothing fancy about it, but it did the trick. Then there were the root vegetables. While the frozen soil outside killed most greenery, hardy roots like turnips or carrots could be stored in cool, dry areas to last through the season. These were often thrown into the same bubbling stew as the meat. Whatever was in the pot would stretch to feed as many people as possible. These meals weren't just functional, though. They were vital moments of warmth. Picture a family huddled near the central hearth, bowls of steaming stew in their hands. The food burns their tongues just enough to be irritating, but no one stops eating. For a while, bellies full and the fire flickering. Things might feel almost cozy, even when frost coats the edges of the walls. The Vikings weren't vegetarians by any stretch of the imagination, but dairy played a surprisingly critical role in rounding out their calories. With cows or goats in the longhouse, fresh milk was an occasional luxury. More often, though, milk was turned into something that would last longer: cheese and butter. These high-fat staples not only provided essential energy, but they also kept well through the winter months. Hard, salty cheeses were stored in wheels, described as pucks of milk-solid survival, perfect for chewing, trading, or, at a stretch, staving off wolves if you threw it hard enough. Butter was churned when the opportunity arose and could be scooped onto nearly anything they ate, adding a much-needed caloric boost to an otherwise sparse plate. Oh, and let's not forget skyr. Part yogurt, part cheese, skyr was beloved. If beloved can also mean sour enough to make you wince. High in protein and tangy to the extreme, it was a true Viking invention. Practical, sustaining, and slightly painful to consume. It was food that simultaneously nourished you and made sure you never got too comfortable. Now, Imagine all of this together. A Viking family gathers around the fire, ladling bowls of stew from a pot that has likely been simmering all day. Each spoonful contains a mix of tough meat, softened root vegetables, and maybe a sprinkling of barley. Bread, heavy and a bit dry, is passed around, used to scoop up the last bits of stew lingering at the bottom of each bowl. Someone grabs one of the harder chunks of cheese, gnaws at it idly, and passes it along. No one's concerned with flavor combinations, plating, or culinary presentation. It's about filling stomachs, keeping bodies warm, and moving on to the next task. While hearty meals like these were vital for survival, the Vikings didn't leave everything to their stew pots. Preservation was a skill honed to perfection, and it wasn't just limited to meat. Smoked and fermented fish were staples, sure, but grains like barley and rye were stored carefully, kept free of pests as best as possible. Fruits, when available in warmer months, were often dried to preserve them for later. Imagine biting into a dried apple in December, a reminder, however faint, of sunnier days. Everything edible was given a second life, and waste was unthinkable. Every part of an animal was used, from bones for broth to intestinal casings for sausage. In some ways, their food philosophy was a masterclass in resourcefulness. Alcohol deserves a mention here. Practical, at times, comforting, absolutely. Mead, made with fermented honey, and ale, brewed from barley, were staples of a Viking winter diet, not just because they provided much-needed calories, but because they offered a mental reprieve. A tankard of mead by the fire wasn't going to erase the realities of crowded longhouses, livestock in the next room, and bitter cold outside, but it could make you forget them for a little while. And hey, if you're going to bundle up in furs and drink by a fire, you might as well enjoy doing it. But food wasn't just a way to survive. It fueled everything else. Without a high-calorie diet, Vikings couldn't chop wood, haul water, or even maintain the fires they depended on. Every task became a drain on energy stores, and those calories weren't just niceties, they were literal fuel. When you spent all day breaking up frozen ground to reach your buried root vegetables or braving icy waters to catch fish through a carved hole, every bite of salted pork or hardened cheese became as necessary as your layers of wool. The Viking diet wasn't gourmet, but it was brilliant in its simplicity. It worked. The food they ate didn't just keep them going. It gave them the physical and mental endurance to power through endless nights, relentless storms, and the psychological weight of seasonal isolation. Meals weren't just survival. They were a reason to gather, to sit close to the people who mattered, and to remind each other that they were tough enough to make it through. Every scoop of stew and every bite of dense bread was a promise. Tomorrow might be just as tough, but they'd still be here for it. Of course, food couldn't solve everything. Even with full stomachs and warm fires, the endless darkness of winter still took its toll. Seasonal depression is a modern term, but the Vikings knew the feeling well. Cold, isolation, and monotony wore people down, and when the snow piled high and the winds howled long into the night, food wasn't enough to keep spirits lifted. So what did they do? What else could keep morale high, even when the days ran seamlessly into endless nights? This wasn't a problem they ignored. They faced it head-on, with stories, laughter, and the occasional feast. How do you survive endless winter darkness without losing your mind? If you were a Viking, the answer was pretty straightforward. Stories, humor, and the occasional riotous feast. Forget for a moment the freezing temperatures and crowded living conditions. Those were miserable but manageable. The real challenge could be the slow grind of freezing monotony. And the Vikings knew this, which is why they fought it the best way they could. They didn't just endure the cold. They distracted themselves from it with sagas, laughter, games, and plenty of shared moments that kept the dark from swallowing them whole. Let's start with the sagas. These weren't just entertainment. They were the backbone of Viking storytelling culture. Oral epics passed down from generation to generation that helped stitch together their shared identity. Nights around a smoky hearth could easily spiral into boredom or despair without something to anchor morale. That's when the sagas came alive. They weren't just about gods and heroes, though there was plenty of that. Odin, Loki, Thor, these were household names, but their adventures were more than just larger-than-life drama. The tales usually carried layers of meaning, recounting past glories or offering lessons wrapped up in wild, often absurd storytelling. Listeners weren't just audiences, they were participants in something larger. For the Vikings, these stories were a way to feel connected, not just to each other, but to ancestors who had faced the same hardship centuries earlier. In a way, hearing a saga didn't just pass the time. It reminded you why you were tough enough to survive. But the real magic of the sagas wasn't their content. It was how they brought people together. Imagine a scene in the dead of winter. The family, huddled around the fire, faces lit mostly by flickering flames. The storyteller, maybe an elder or someone who knew just how to command attention, begins weaving a tale from memory. Their voice rises and falls, pulling listeners into a world far removed from their smoke-filled longhouse. Laughter occasionally breaks in during the funnier bits. Yes, Vikings loved a good laugh at the expense of even their gods. And gasps ripple through the group when the story takes a sharp turn. For those moments, the icy winds outside are forgotten. It's not just warmth, but a shared experience that makes the room feel alive. Of course, stories alone don't keep the darkness at bay. Sometimes you need something to shake up the monotony altogether, which is probably why the Vikings put a premium on humor. And we're not talking about gentle, polite humor here. Viking wit was rough, blunt, and often deeply sarcastic. Picture two brothers in a longhouse, taking jabs at each other while everyone laughs, except maybe the goat, which is also in the room, and has been the subject of one too many jokes about the smell. This wasn't just mindless teasing though. Humor served a purpose. It lightened the crushing weight of survival. When someone cracked a joke, even about the struggle of dealing with smoky air or tight quarters, it reminded everyone else that they were part of the same fight. Shared laughter broke up the stress and proved, if nothing else, that they could face hardship with a grin, or at least a pained smirk. On top of sagas and sarcasm, the Vikings had one other guaranteed way to lift spirits: feasting. Food, after all, wasn't just sustenance. It was communal, a reason to gather, and the occasional excuse to go all out. And while everyday meals were predictable, soupy stews and rock-hard bread, feasts were something else entirely. These were opportunities to dig into the supplies they'd hoarded since the fall. Meat, often preserved for months, was brought out in abundance. Ale and mead, brewed earlier in the year, were poured freely. Butter, cheese, and anything that added richness made an appearance. And while it wasn't a daily event, it didn't have to be. The very fact that feasts were infrequent only made them feel more significant, a reminder that not everything about winter had to be bleak. The midwinter festival of Yule was perhaps the ultimate example of this. Held around the winter solstice, it gave the community something to look forward to when the days were at their shortest. Fires were lit to symbolize the returning sun. Animals were sacrificed to ensure the gods would bless the coming year, and families would gather for days of celebrating. While Yule had its rituals, the toasts, the sacrifices, the observances, the sheer act of feasting together in the middle of winter was a kind of spiritual recharge. It was a moment for hope. If they had made it this far into winter together, they could surely last until spring. Imagine a Viking feast for just a moment. The longhouse, usually quiet aside from murmured conversations or the occasional livestock clatter, is alive with noise. There's laughter, the clink of mugs, and the ripple of a saga being retold at one end of the room. A table, or more likely, just a long board balanced across trestles, is sagging under plates of smoked fish, slabs of pork, and dense breads. Even people who might not have much to say on an average day add their voices to the mix, because feasting wasn't just about food. It was about fighting back against the cold, the dark, and the sense of isolation winter could bring. For the Vikings, activities like this weren't trivial. They were ways to endure, not just mentally, but socially. Even small things, like riddles or games, could work wonders for morale. Board games made of simple wooden pieces might sit in the corners of longhouses, nearly forgotten until an especially long night made them invaluable. Wrestling matches, sparring sessions, even contests of wit all served the same purpose. They weren't just about passing the time. They were about reminding everyone that winter, for all its hardships, wasn't all there was. Laughter, competition, and play were ways of staying human in a season that wanted to wear you down until you were little more than hungry, cold, and tired. But there's more to surviving the darkness than storytelling, eating, or cracking jokes. It's about mindset, and this might be where the Vikings stood apart. They didn't approach winter with dread. To them, it wasn't an inconvenience. It was simply part of life. You faced it with preparation, with strength, and, with enough distractions, you endured. Their culture trained them to see hardship not as failure, but as a test of character. Surviving a brutal winter wasn't a fluke. It was proof of their resilience. It's probably no coincidence that this stoic endurance became such a defining characteristic of the Viking way of life. They didn't fight their environment. They adapted to it in ways that brought warmth not just to their bodies, but to their spirits too. And the thing is, these communal experiences weren't just about basic survival. They built bonds that winter strengthened further. Facing the unrelenting cold together, whether through stories shared around a fire, laughter that echoed through the smoky air, or a night spent feasting on preserved meat, wasn't just a coping mechanism. It was a reminder that no one was alone in this struggle. It's no accident that the Vikings carried those values of community and togetherness wherever they went, even after their winter survival days turned into spring planting and summer sailing. It started here, in longhouses filled with the murmur of sagas, the warmth of shared meals, and the occasional sound of someone laughing at their own terrible joke about the weather. For them, surviving the endless winter nights wasn't just about staying alive. It was about finding ways to keep living. And through that, even the darkest stretches of the year had a flicker of light, a sound of laughter, or the promise of one more story. But all of this, stories, feasts, humor, depended on being physically warm enough to enjoy it. And on that front, the Vikings had yet another secret weapon, one that didn't involve wool or stew, the sauna. Because somehow, in the middle of winter's icy grip, they found a way to sweat it out. What's the Viking secret to staying warm? You might think it's all about thick cloaks and roaring fires, But they had another trick up their fur-lined sleeves. Sweat, specifically sweat, steam, and then, just to really keep things interesting, snow. Viking saunas, or badster, weren't the luxury spa treatments we think of today. Instead, they were part of survival. These small, smoky spaces became one of their strongest defenses against the cold, and not just because water tossed over hot stones made you feel like you'd tricked your body into remembering what warmth was. These sweat lodges had a simple design, stone and turf constructions that were more functional than pretty. No ornate details, nothing made to impress. The purpose was practical. Trap heat, create steam, and keep it insulated against the brutal winters outside. Imagine a small hut, low to the earth because all the best heat would rise and you'd want to keep things close. Inside, smooth stones sat at the ready, waiting to be heated to the point that they could handle buckets of water splashed over them. The Viking sauna wasn't just an occasional treat for fun. It was designed for effectiveness. By this point, you've realized the Vikings weren't about showing off. They were about what worked, and sweating out the cold worked. Stepping into a Viking sauna wasn't exactly glamorous. They weren't huge, open spaces like modern bathhouses. These were tight, intimate quarters. Once the stones were misted, the steam thickened the air and brought a humid, almost suffocating warmth. Shirts came off, wool garments were dropped, and soon the gathering became part physical and part social. The intense heat was more than a reprieve. It was a reset. Out in the winter air, the body tensed against the cold. Circulation slowed. Blood retreated inward for warmth. But in the sauna, you relaxed under the heat. Your skin flushed. Your body temperature shot up for the first time in who knows how long, and your heart raced to keep up with the heat. It wasn't just about comfort, though. There were practical benefits to all this sweating. Saunas offered the closest thing the Vikings had to actual hygiene. Sitting in that steamy environment, sweating buckets, not only warmed you up, but also worked as primitive cleansing. Sure, they weren't scrubbing down with lime-scented soaps or shower sprays, but you can imagine that after days of wearing the same wool tunic, sweating out a little grime and rolling in snow afterward felt almost refreshing. And yes, snow. Because when you emerged from the suffocating warmth of the sauna, the next part of the Viking ritual often involved jumping straight into freezing water or rolling in freshly fallen snow. Why? Partly because they could, and partly because shocking the system like this seemed to improve circulation. Plus, it was a test of toughness. Let's be clear, not everyone could roll naked in the snow like it was a casual Tuesday. It wasn't just practical, it was a display of resilience. Picture this. A Viking trudges through snow to the badster. His heavy boots crunch against the frost-covered ground. The wind cuts through the layers of fur he's wearing, biting at any skin left exposed. Then he steps inside the sauna. The cold falls away almost instantly as the thick, steamy heat hits him. He sits down, his breath slower now, sweat forming. There's silence, but there's also that unmistakable hum of relief as his body, for once, feels warm without the aid of wool or firelight. 20 minutes later, he steps back out into the freezing landscape. Shirtless, barefoot, steam rising off his skin as the snow crunches underfoot. His body feels alive in a way that's almost exhilarating, shocking itself against the brutal air. He rolls in the snow, because that's what you do. It's brutal, it's borderline ridiculous, but it works. For the Vikings, though, these saunas weren't just about feeling physically better. They were spaces for healing, bonding, and sometimes major life events. These little rooms of heat became makeshift hospitals when someone was ill, got a nasty frostbite situation. Throw them in the sauna for a while and hope for the best. Childbirth, the most vulnerable time imaginable, happened here too. Mothers gave birth surrounded by heat, not just for comfort, but potentially to stave off the chill that could be life-threatening during labor. If you were sick, injured, or just worn down, the sauna could be a place to reset. And it makes sense when you think about what raw heat does to sore muscles, stiff joints, or a body beaten down by winter. It's easy to imagine how stepping into sauna rituals became a kind of go-to solution for the Vikings when everything else in life revolved around the cold. But saunas were more than healing places or temperature shock experiments. They were communal. Entire families, sometimes even extended networks of neighbors, would gather in the sauna. And while it does sound a bit strange, sweating it out shoulder to shoulder, it made sense. There was no room for modesty. When you're dealing with survival, things like personal space take a back seat to practicality. Sitting together in this intense, humid environment wasn't just a way to share warmth, it was a way to share time. Conversations flowed more easily, jokes cut through the air, and the smoky, steamy sauna became yet another glue binding the community together. After all, this wasn't a society built on isolation. Vikings saw strength in numbers, and what better way to strengthen a relationship than by sweating beside someone in the middle of winter? Even beyond practicality, the sauna also connected to Viking ideas of resilience. Voluntarily pushing their bodies through extremes, intense heat followed by sharp cold, wasn't just survival strategy. It was a mindset. It trained them to handle the unpredictable, to embrace hardship before they were forced into it. That kind of discipline wasn't just for show. It was ingrained in how they faced all challenges, not just winter. Saunas, in some way, mirrored the Viking worldview. Strength through adaptability, toughness through shared experience, and survival through resourcefulness. Think about the sheer contrast of it all. Inside the bad stir, the heat feels almost unbearable, sweat pouring as the warm air presses you down. Then, moments later, you're back outside in this vast frozen expanse of white, snow chilling your skin and burning your lungs as you breathe it in. It's a shock to the system, sure, but more than that, it's a reminder that you're alive in conditions most wouldn't choose to face. A reminder that even in the coldest, darkest days, there's resilience in leaning into extremes. And here's the part that's easy to forget. The sauna wasn't just some side element of Viking winters. It was a tool, a system, a lifestyle in itself. It was physical, it was communal, and at its heart, it was deeply practical. From sore muscles to frostbite recovery, from birthing rooms to bonding rituals, the Viking sauna found a way to do it all. This wasn't luxury. It wasn't convenience. It was survival, wrapped in steam and sealed with snow. To the Vikings, winter didn't just demand endurance. It demanded ingenuity, culture, and occasionally, a steam-filled reminder that even in the harshest conditions, warmth could still be created, even if that warmth came from a pile of very hot rocks and a willingness to freeze your shaved head off in the snow afterward. The Vikings didn't just survive winter, they turned it into a proving ground. Through clever resourcefulness and deep respect for their surroundings, they crafted a way of life built on community, resilience, and practicality. They knew the land would never bend to their needs, so they adapted. Their homes, clothing, food, even their rituals were all tools. not just to endure, but to thrive. So what lessons do we take from them? Maybe it's this. Survival isn't just about tools or strength. It's about connection, both to the people around you and to the world itself. Even in darkness, they found warmth.